So without further delay, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Liz Martins, Senior Economist at HSBC, and she's going to provide a review of the UK economy and its road to recovery.
Thank you very much, Lem. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be virtually with you today. I want to talk about the UK recovery. I'll also speak a little bit about the global economy and some of the things that we as developed economies have in common with others across Europe, the US, the developed world more generally. But I wanted to begin, before I start with my slides, with a general observation about this extraordinary economic cycle that we've just been through. And that is that we talk a lot about what the pandemic has done to the economy, and maybe we don't talk enough about what the pandemic has not done to the economy, because usually after a recession, the economy emerges leaner. It's got a higher unemployment rate. Businesses that aren't working have failed, and maybe companies have cut their prices to get people back in again. And that makes it easier to rebound. You know, there's an abundant supply of cheap labor, for example. It enables the economy to restart. In this cycle, we haven't pressed the reset button in that normal way. We pressed the pause button thanks to, in the UK, Rishi Sunak's incredibly successful furlough scheme and other package of support measures. So we've come into the recession with full employment. And we've come out of it and pressed restart, and it hasn't really changed very much. So we haven't got that leanness, that availability that might usually follow a recession. We haven't reset. We've just pressed pause and then restart. And I think that's perhaps a good framework for thinking about some of the issues and the challenges that we're now facing. So I'd like to begin by looking at the GDP forecasts for the global economy and the advanced economies. And what these charts are showing you is essentially a depiction of the incredible success of government intervention and government support for economies through the pandemic. Not only does GDP get back to that 100 line, which is where we were pre-pandemic, pretty quickly. It'll be done for advanced economies by the middle part of this year, or the end of this year, rather. But not only that, but we get back to where we would have been had there not been a pandemic by the end of 2022. And in the case of the advanced economies, GDP ends up above where it would have been without a pandemic. And that's a pretty incredible thing to be able to say. Which is testament to the stimulus that's been provided in response to the pandemic challenges, and particularly in Europe, the Next Generation EU spending program, in the US, the infrastructure spending bill. But we have a problem in the meantime, and it's a problem of success, because if you have an economy which has been shut down for large parts of the last 18 months, and then you have demand coming roaring back, you don't need to have been to economics school to know that that's going to give you supply shortages, and it's going to give you inflation pressures. So this chart is the Global Purchasing Managers Index survey. And what it's telling you is that across sectors, including, of course, the construction sector, it is taking longer for supply deliveries to arrive in October 2021 than it was in 2020 at the height of the pandemic, when everything was locked down. And that's a pretty, extreme thing to say. This is something that we are seeing worldwide. These are the skyrocketing number of mentions of the word shortage by the US Federal Reserve. On the right-hand side, we've got the number of times people have Googled the word shortage worldwide. And there are two, I guess, particular areas that of note and that are particularly weighing on the global economy's ability to maintain that pace of recovery. One is chips that go into cars. I've got a colleague who's just taken delivery of the brand new car that he ordered last December. there's a big fall in the production of cars, and as we know, this has knock-on effects for used cars, which are seeing quite rampant rates of inflation at the moment. And the other, of course, is container shipping, where depending on who you are and what measure you use and where you're measuring from, the cost of bringing goods in from Asia has increased by factors of 5, 6, 7, 8 times, which is really obviously, what Lem referred to at the beginning, these rates of price increases that we've really not seen before. The other thing that we're short on is, of course, labour. I know in your sector this is a very long-standing issue, but it is spreading across sectors. It is in every strata of the economy, from the lowest paid to the most highly paid. In the US, we are starting to see the shortages translate into wage growth. You can see that in the chart on the left. In the Eurozone, that is less the case so far, although it may still prove to be a factor through 2022. And I'll speak more about the specific labour market issues in UK in just a moment. But another factor weighing on the recovery, I think, is mobility. Now, Lem mentioned that this could be the new normal, that we are conducting part of this event virtually. It certainly seems that people have voted with their feet in terms of the amount of work that they want to do remotely and at home. If we look at the social mobility numbers, they've recovered pretty well. So the theatres are full again, the restaurants, etc., the nightclubs. But workplace mobility is still way down on pre-pandemic levels. So this chart shows you the transport aspect of that, the New York City subway and bus networks, and then on the other side, the data for TfL, Transport for London, which again are way down on pre-pandemic. And I think this is important because when we talk about consumption, we talk about that side that we see, going down to your local high street and seeing all the queues outside places for brunch and, not being able to get tickets for things. But there is another aspect of consumption which really hasn't recovered, and that is all the consumption associated with workplace mobility. If you think about the transport you use to get to your office, and then the coffee that you buy on your way, and the lunch that you buy, and maybe the friend that you meet for a drink because you're in town anyway, all of that kind of consumption, which broadly doesn't happen when you're sitting at home. So I think this is an interesting constraint perhaps on the recovery, albeit there are, of course, many positives to working from home. So moving on to the UK specifically, and I thought we could start with looking at where we are in this rebound. Now, GDP in the third quarter was 2% below where it was pre-pandemic, and that's pretty much in line with the European average. French GDP is back to where it was pre-pandemic. Spanish GDP is still 6.5% lower due to their reliance on tourism and another bad year for tourism. But broadly speaking, the UK is kind of average in that sense. However, if we look at it and break it down by the components, you can see that it's government spending that's way above where it was pre-pandemic. And these other aspects, consumption, investment, particularly trade volumes, that are still way down on their pre-pandemic levels. If we look at it by sector, I'm happy to say that you have lots of wonderful construction experts coming to speak to you later, and I am not one of them. But top line, if we look at the GDP by sector, construction was the first of the three broad sector groups in the UK to get back above to its pre-pandemic level. Unfortunately, it has slipped back below since then for reasons that I have to think must relate to the global supply shortages rather than any shortage of demand. If we then look to the surveys, again, having been at the top of the tree at times earlier this year, construction has fallen to the bottom of the tree, but again, probably relating to supply, not demand, and a little bit of better news in the most recent survey for all three of the UK's main sector groups, construction, manufacturing, and services. So that's kind of where we are in the cycle, and then perhaps we can use the remaining 10 minutes of my presentation to look ahead at some of the risks facing the UK economy. The first and most important one, I think, has to be the income squeeze. So this is the impact of higher inflation. We think inflation is going to peak at about 5% in April when we get yet another energy price rise, a household utility price rise. And we think that if you put together the impact of inflation, the impact of withdrawn government support, and the impact of the tax rises, the health and social care levy that we'll all be paying from April, we think actually UK households are going to see their real incomes fall next year by 1.4%, unless we get offsetting wage growth. And just to give you an idea, our back of the envelope calculation suggests that we need to see 5.7% wage growth over 2022 for UK households, essentially to break even, to offset the inflation that we see and the tax rise that's coming through as well. The other big risk, and getting a bit circular here, but coming back to that wage growth, is the persistent labour market imbalances. And this is kind of what I was talking about at the very beginning in terms of where we are in the cycle and not having had a big reset. There are shortages of labour wherever you look in the UK economy. The chart on the left-hand side shows you that demand skyrocketing, availability of labour plummeting. And how does this resolve itself? Well, I have to say I'm not particularly optimistic it will in the next couple of years, because how does it resolve itself? Either you need a collapse in demand for labour, which is essentially a recession, or investing in technology that can do the job of people, neither of which seem on the horizon, or you need an increase in supply of labour. And that supply, of course, can come from overseas if the government is going to relax the rules on immigration, but that doesn't feel particularly likely. Or it can come from an increase in the domestic participation rate. But if we look at the chart on the right, you can see that inactivity did rise a little in the pandemic, but it didn't rise a lot. So these are people leaving the labour force to become retired, or to become a student, or because they are long-term sick, or what have you. There's not a huge amount of slack here to solve the UK's labour market problems. So I feel that they may persist perhaps beyond the next couple of years. In fact, such is the state of the labour market that companies are having to become ever more creative. So I like this tweet by James Timpson of Timpson's chain of key cutters, saying, "We are finding it hard to recruit great people from prison," which is something they've been doing for a long time, because suddenly they're finding that all other companies are going down the same route. Such is the shortage of labour in this economy. You have to think then that will give you wage growth, and possibly even enough wage growth to come back to my earlier point about the income squeeze, to allow households to break even. And I think if we look at this chart, which indexes wages back to 100, the sector that's had a decent pay rise since the end of 2019 is finance. Other sectors, including construction, if we believe the Office for National Statistics numbers, really haven't seen the greatest growth, even though they are the ones where we've seen acute shortages of labour: construction, manufacturing, distribution, hotels and restaurants. You would expect these pay levels to have gone up perhaps more, and it suggests that there is certainly more scope for upside in the labour market through 2022. Put it all together, we've got a bit of a dilemma for the Bank of England. And, you know, I think the underlying inflation pressures, we know that the bank can't do anything. They can't pump more gas out of Russia. They can't provide lorry drivers to drive all the goods around. They can't get global oil prices back down, but they can address the underlying domestically generated inflation pressures, including those of the labour market. And that's what they're intending to do. So as you can see, the market expects a lot of rate rises, 5 in just over a year, actually, taking bank rate back up to 1.25%. Our own forecasts are for considerably less tightening. We think that rates will rise only to 0.75% at the start of 2023 before momentum leaves the economy and we don't need so much tightening. Another risk I wanted to mention is Brexit. Brexit is already making its impact felt. I know the waters are very muddied by the global supply chain shortages, by the pandemic, by lots of other things going on. But, you know, one thing that the pandemic and the global situation can't explain is why Eurozone exports have recovered in line with global trade, and UK exports, as you can see in the chart on the right, have stagnated all through 2021, which coincidentally is the period after which the end of the Brexit transition period ended. That's before any further deterioration in relations, but of course we could have that with Article 16, which would make things even more complicated. Now, at this point, I know I've thoroughly depressed you, so I've put this lovely picture of the Maldives to try and lift your spirits back up again. But I wanted actually to defeat the doom and gloom economist stereotype and finish on some positives. So the first positive is that we have all saved a lot of money over the pandemic. Our calculation is that households have saved £212 billion more than we usually would. That's about 10% of GDP. And we don't need people to spend all of that money. We don't even need them to send a little bit of that money. We just need them to save less than they did last year, and that will support consumption growth. And that feels almost inevitable, that we will save less money in 2022 than we did in 2021, given how little we've been out in 2021. So that is definitely supportive for consumption. The next upside risk, or rather good news, I should say, is that we are going to have rate rises, but they should have a fairly muted effect on the economy, and that's because the private sector has become a lot less exposed to rate rises than it once was. So 80% of all outstanding mortgages are on a fixed rate. If you have a 5-year fixed expiring today, you can still probably get a better rate today than when you took your mortgage out 5 years ago. Consumer credit, consumers are already behaving as if rates have gone up, because actually that's fallen by 12% over the pandemic. People are paying off their credit cards at the end of the month. They're not racking up new debt. Businesses, of course, did take out loans in the pandemic, but the rise has been relatively small, and there has been a much bigger rise actually in deposits and cash balances for businesses. So businesses are also less exposed than they once would have been to floating rates. So in fact, the biggest victim of higher interest rates will be Chancellor Rishi Sunak, and we're starting to see that already with the UK debt service spending. I noticed in the numbers last week was up 212% year on year in October. So the impact of higher inflation, higher interest rates is already making its presence felt, and higher rates will I think will hurt the government perhaps more than it will hurt the private sector at this point. Finally, I think, going back to my beginning slide where I said, the fact that we're not back to pre-pandemic levels in these components of GDP, consumption, investment, and so on, is a good thing, because you've got more of that momentum, that trampoline effect where we continue to recover. Look at this business investment chart on the left-hand side. It's quite a sad story. And yet the chart on the right-hand side tells us that businesses, at the start of 2021 at least, were really keen to start investing again. After all those years of uncertainty through Brexit, through the pandemic, as we come into 2021, businesses really started in very good spirits, wanted to increase capital investment. The government then came along with the March budget with the super deduction policy, which should really encourage spending. And you have to think that the reason that business investment on the left hasn't really responded, again, comes down to those supply constraints rather than demand. If you want to invest in a new fleet of vehicles, then you can't do so because of the global shipping crisis and the chip shortage, etc. If you want to make your building energy efficient, you might find it's very hard to get a builder or the skilled labor that you need to do that. And so again, I think it's the supply side rather than the demand side, and hopefully that gives us scope for some recovery when those supply side constraints do start to ease. So I think that really rounds up the points that I wanted to make in the first instance. We are going to open to Q&A, so please do post your questions if you have any. But I'll round up with some key conclusions. So the global economic rebound has been a remarkable success. The idea that we can now forecast GDP being above where it would have been had we not had a pandemic by the end of 2022 is really quite remarkable. But of course, nothing is cost-free, and the price that we appear to be paying for this recession is inflation. In the UK, the recovery is almost complete, but it's been public sector driven, We now need to see the private sector moving forward, and there's plenty of risks to that, including the household income squeeze, inflation, labour market imbalances, monetary tightening, and Brexit. But on the upside, the good news, those final couple of slides, that we could see the deployment of saved income, which is going to boost consumption, and also that investment rebound that looks like we're just on the verge of it, but it's not happening just yet. So with that, I will leave it there, and I think we have time for a few Q&As.
Well, thanks very much, Liz. Yes, so I think we've got about 5 minutes for a Q&A. And while I think our delegates think of things to ask you, I'm going to plunge in. You mentioned that you're seeing increasing cash balances on company balance sheets, and you talked about that in the context of coronavirus support loans. Lots of sort of perhaps cautious management of expenditure has had a positive impact there. It's something we've seen across our own research in looking at the 100 biggest contractors in our industry and across specialists, that cash balances have been going up. Do you have a feel for how long companies will hoard that cash, or do you think we're going to see a wave of mergers and acquisitions activity once people feel the cash burning a hole in their pocket?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it feels like something that certainly won't go on forever. I think you're right. There is an element of caution to it, and I have to keep being very careful about using phrases like post-pandemic, because of course it's not over. There's still uncertainty. And so maybe the first thing that we need to do is make sure that the pandemic is firmly in the rearview mirror, and perhaps the spring might be a better sort of time frame for that. But yeah, I mean, it's something that we see in the official data in terms of deposit growth, and it's also something that we see in our own business. If I talk to my colleagues in the commercial bank, they're saying, their customers again are upbeat, have positive outlooks on the growth outlook, but are kind of saying to us, well, we've got these overdraft facilities or lending facilities available that they just don't need to draw upon because they've got these huge cash piles. So I think the confidence is there, but there's a wait and see. And then again, there's this supply issue. Yeah, so I think those are the main kind of constraints.
One thing you didn't touch on in your presentation, so you may not be qualified to comment, but one of the rising costs that our audience sees is in insurance. Professional indemnity insurance has been a particularly difficult market. Is that something you see changing anytime soon, or are high premiums here to stay?
Well, I'm not an expert on that really. I think that the level of risk aversion, I think, probably is going to be with us for a while, which leads to higher premiums. And I think, what's just happened in the last couple of years, that's understandable. It really did just go to prove that absolutely anything can come along and derail everything. So I think from that perspective, insurers, I think, probably have got to try and claw back some revenues from the losses that they've taken, but also make sure that they are on top of new emerging risks, I guess.
And we do have a question from our audience. How worried should we be about reductions in public sector spending, especially with interest rates rising over the coming year?
Yeah, so I mean, this is about, I guess, the cost of debt service spending, which I mentioned in my presentation. So if we are spending more and more, same as any household, if we as a country are spending more and more on paying down our debt, then there's less money to go around for anything else, particularly if the government is determined to meet its fiscal targets. So of course, it's said that it wants to make sure the current budget is balanced, not in deficit. So we're only borrowing to invest. Well, if a lot of that current budget is taken up by spending on debt, then that means, and we want to meet those targets, then that means that the savings have to be found elsewhere. Now, the question mentions a cut in public sector spending. I'm not sure there's much scope to cut, to be honest. public sector spending levels are still relatively low after the austerity of the last kind of 10 years. And there's not too much scope really for further cuts. So if the government is going to be looking for further spending savings, then maybe those come from tax rises instead. And I've been, to be honest, surprised by how far they've already gone with tax rises. We've got the national insurance coming through in April, but the year after that, we've got the rising corporation tax, which of course is huge, really, from 19% to 25%. A 6 percentage point rise is quite significant. So the government's done that already, and yet, the risk is that it's still not going to be enough, and they'll have to go even further. And I suspect that it probably does come from additional tax revenues rather than cuts to spending, given that there's just not really much scope for further cuts.
Well, sadly, Liz, we've come to the end of allotted time. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us, and particularly thank you for that lovely picture of the Maldives. I think that's warmed us up on a cold winter's day today. But thanks again, Liz.
Thank you.